Did medieval people try to win hearts with a special dance? Did they send secret love letters through pigeons that got lost? Did medieval people try to spice things up using bizarre potions and rituals? Number 12. The Moonlight Maiden's Mirror Gaze. Dating back to times when candles were the brightest lights at night, some hopeful souls believed they could glimpse their future spouse with a specific ritual. A common one involved a young woman heading out alone on a specific night, like Saint Agnes Eve. The legend went that if she walked into a field, or a quiet churchyard, or even just looked into a clear pool of water, her future husband's face might appear. Sometimes the instruction was to eat a very salty meal before bed, and then not drink anything. The idea was that her future husband would appear in a dream offering her water. This was not a quick plan for meeting someone, but a desperate leap into the unknown. A local anecdote from the hamlet of Oakhaven, recorded in a tattered almanac from the year 1391, describes a young woman named Alara who attempted this very thing. She followed the instructions to the letter, spending a cold St. Agnes Eve sitting by the village well, staring intently at her reflection in the dark water. The moon was a sliver above the crooked oak tree, casting long, dancing shadows. Alara sat there for what felt like hours, shivering in her thin cloak, her eyes straining in the dim light. She saw the familiar outline of her own face, distorted slightly by ripples from a passing gust of wind. The water remained dark, and no mysterious, handsome visage materialized. The only thing she gained was a severe chill that kept her abed for 3 days, much to the exasperation of her mother, who needed help with the spinning. The future husband remained a mystery, and Alara, once recovered, returned to her daily chores with the same lack of suitors as before. The well offered no magical insight, only cold water and a reflection that was stubbornly her own. Another tale from a collection of rural superstitions compiled by a monastic scholar in Northumberland around 1420 details a different variant. A young man, Giles, was advised to stand at a crossroads at midnight facing east and throw a handful of hemp seeds over his left shoulder while chanting an old rhyme. The belief was that the image of his future wife would appear behind him, gathering the seeds. Giles, desperate for a match in a village with few eligible women, tried this on a particularly dark and moonless night. The wind howled through the bare trees, making the whole experience feel more ominous than romantic. He chanted the rhyme, his voice barely audible above the wind, and scattered the seeds. He waited, his heart thumping against his ribs. Nothing happened. No ghostly figure appeared. Instead, a pack of stray dogs, drawn by the scent of the seeds, suddenly materialized from the darkness, barking loudly and sending Giles fleeing back to his cottage in terror. He spent the rest of the night barricaded indoors, convinced he had awakened some malevolent spirit rather than found a future bride. The seeds were gone, the dogs dispersed, and Giles remained a bachelor, just as he was before his midnight adventure. The supernatural seemed to have no interest in his romantic future, only in his scattered hemp seeds. Number 11. The Calculated Feint, or the Damsel in Distress Gambit. In an age where public displays of emotion were more common, and a little drama could certainly capture attention, some people tried to use a sudden collapse or a show of extreme fragility to get noticed. The idea was that a well-timed feint, especially in the presence of an admired individual, would surely bring a rush of concern, a helping hand, and perhaps even a spark of romantic interest. It was a play for sympathy, a way to appear delicate and in need of protection, a quality often admired in women of the time. For men, it might involve exaggerating an injury from a tournament or a minor scuffle, hoping a sympathetic lady would tend to their wounds. Chronicle from the town of Salisbury, dated 1358, recounts the story of Lady Seraphina, a young noblewoman keen to secure a good match. She had her eyes on Sir Alaric, a knight known for his chivalry and impressive lineage. During a particularly lively feast at the Lord's Manor, Lady Seraphina, after carefully positioning herself near Sir Alaric, attempted her calculated feign. With a delicate sigh, she swayed dramatically, her eyes rolling upwards, and began to descend towards the rush-strewn floor. Her intention was to land softly, hoping Sir Alaric would be the first to reach her. However, the hall was crowded, and a large, boisterous merchant, a man with heavy boots and even heavier ale consumption, was standing directly behind her. As Seraphina gracefully began her descent, the merchant, not realizing what was happening, simply stepped forward, causing Seraphina to trip over his foot. She landed with a rather undignified thud, her elaborate headwear askew, directly into a platter of roasted goose, scattering greasy drippings onto her fine gown. Sir Alaric, far from rushing to her aid, merely raised an eyebrow in amusement, then turned back to his conversation about falconry. The merchant, oblivious, continued to feast. Lady Seraphina, mortified and covered in goose fat, was quickly helped to her feet by her scandalized chaperone, her grand dramatic gesture having resulted in nothing but public humiliation and a ruined dress. A similar incident, documented in a series of letters exchanged between country squires in Gloucestershire around 1405, tells of a young squire, Thomas, who wished to impress the beautiful daughter of a neighboring lord, Lady Isolde. Thomas had heard that Lady Isolde was deeply compassionate and admired bravery. During a local jousting exhibition, Thomas, who was not a particularly skilled fighter, decided to exaggerate a minor tumble from his horse. After being unseated, he lay on the ground, groaning loudly and clutching his leg. Hoping Lady Isolde would rush from the viewing stands with concern, he waited for her gentle touch, for her worried words. What he received instead was the brusque attention of the tournament's medic, a gruff man named Master Gregory, who, after a quick and painful examination, declared Thomas to be merely bruised. Master Gregory then administered a foul-smelling poultice made of herbs and animal fat, insisting Thomas consume a bitter potion to prevent feigned weakness from turning into real malady. Lady Isolde, meanwhile, had not even noticed Thomas's theatrical display. She was engrossed in watching the next joust, cheering loudly for a more successful and genuinely valiant knight. Thomas spent the rest of the day limping, both from his minor bruise and the humiliation of his failed performance, and avoiding the medic's further remedies. His plan, to appear vulnerable and brave, had only made him seem foolish and fragile. Number 10. The secret message via go-between. When direct conversation was often difficult or forbidden, especially between young lovers from different social standings, the idea of sending a secret message seemed like a brilliant solution. Trusted servant, a well-placed friend, or even a carrier pigeon, though less common than popular stories suggest, could act as a go-between delivering a carefully worded note, a small token, or a coded message. This allowed for communication that bypassed strict chaperones and nosy family members. The appeal was in its clandestine nature the thrill of forbidden contact and the hope that a private word could achieve what public interactions could not. A legal record from the Mayor's Court in York from the year 1370 details a dispute involving a young apprentice named Barnaby and a laundress named Agnes. Barnaby had fallen hopelessly in love with Alara, the baker's daughter, who lived across the crowded street. Forbidden by their families to socialize due to a long-standing rivalry over flour prices, Barnaby devised a plan. He wrote a passionate, if grammatically challenged, love poem on a small scrap of parchment. He then entrusted it to Agnes, promising her a halfpenny if she delivered it discreetly to Alara's window while the baker was occupied. Agnes, however, was not known for her discretion or her keen sense of direction. Upon reaching the baker's house, instead of slipping the note through a crack or leaving it on the windowsill, she boldly knocked on the baker's door. When the baker, a large and intimidating man named Thomas, answered, Agnes, flustered and forgetting her instructions, simply handed him the note and mumbled something about a delivery. Thomas, confused, opened the note and read Barnaby's declaration of love to his daughter. His reaction was not one of tender understanding. He stormed across the street, note in hand, and confronted Barnaby's master, a shoemaker, leading to a loud public argument that involved accusations of poaching daughters and threats of withholding future shoe orders. Alara, peeking from her window, saw the whole commotion. Barnaby's secret love poem had become a very public, very embarrassing family feud, and Alara was subsequently forbidden from even looking in the direction of the shoemaker's shop. Another instance, recorded in a collection of aristocratic letters from a Scottish barony in 1432, describes a clever code attempted by Lady Isabel to communicate with a young lord she admired, Lord Callum. Direct communication was impossible, as Isabel's father had strict rules about her interactions with unmarried men. Isabel decided to hide a message within the pages of a popular romance book that Lord Callum was known to borrow from her family's small library. The message was meant to be subtle. Specific words on certain pages, when strung together, would form a clandestine invitation to a garden rendezvous. She painstakingly marked the words with a tiny, almost invisible prick of a pin. The plan seemed foolproof. However, Lord Callum, while an avid reader, was also notoriously clumsy. When he returned the book, he accidentally dropped it into a muddy puddle on his journey. The pages, already damp from the autumn air, absorbed the mud, smudging many of the words. When Isabel later retrieved the book hoping for a reply, she found her carefully marked words unreadable, obscured by streaks of dirt. The coded message was lost unread. Lord Callum later sent a message through his own steward, apologizing for the ruined book, but making no mention of any hidden words or invitations. The opportunity for a secret meeting was literally washed away in the mud, leaving Isabel frustrated and her clever code utterly useless. Number 9. The Grand Serenade, or the Lute Beneath the Window. This was a classic romantic gesture, popularized in ballads and tales of chivalry. A hopeful suitor, usually a young man with some musical talent, or at least access to a lute, would appear beneath his beloved's window late at night. There, in the quiet darkness, he would play a sweet melody and perhaps sing a heartfelt song, declaring his affection. The idea was to serenade the lady, to touch her heart with the beauty of the music and the boldness of the gesture, hopefully prompting her to open her window and acknowledge his devotion. It was a grand, public display of private feeling, designed to make a lasting impression. A legal deposition from Norwich, circa 1410, provides an account of a young man named Cuthbert, a journeyman tailor, who had fallen deeply for Evelyn, the miller's daughter. Evelyn lived in a small cottage near the river, and Cuthbert, having recently acquired a lute from a traveling merchant, decided to try the serenade. He practiced for days, learning a popular love song that he believed would perfectly express his feelings. One moonless night, he crept to Evelyn's window, which was unfortunately located directly beneath her father's sleeping quarters. Cuthbert began to pluck the strings of his lute, his voice, though nervous, rising in the still night air. Poured his heart into the song, convinced Evelyn would be moved. Instead, the first person to respond was the miller himself, a man known for his short temper and even shorter fuse when his sleep was disturbed. The miller burst from his cottage, not Evelyn brandishing a bucket of water and a rather large rolling pin. Without a word, he doused Cuthbert, lute and all, in icy river water, then proceeded to chase him through the village green with the rolling pin. Cuthbert fled, soaked and humiliated, his lute ruined and his romantic aspirations thoroughly dampened. Evelyn, awakened by the commotion, merely watched from her window, stifling a giggle. The grand serenade had only succeeded in incurring the wrath of her father and making Cuthbert the laughingstock of the village for weeks. In another recorded incident, from a collection of jesters' anecdotes in a Florentine manuscript dated 1365, a wealthy merchant's son Lorenzo attempted to serenade a noblewoman, Lady Beatrice. Lorenzo, despite his wealth, had little musical ability and an even less melodic singing voice. He hired a small group of musicians to accompany him, hoping to compensate for his lack of talent. One warm summer evening, they positioned themselves beneath Lady Beatrice's palatial window. Lorenzo began to sing, his voice cracking on the high notes, accompanied by the somewhat chaotic efforts of his hired musicians. The sound was not sweet and enchanting. Instead, it was rather loud and discordant. Lady Beatrice, who valued her quiet evenings and possessed a delicate constitution, did not open her window to bestow a favor. Instead, her personal guard, alerted by the cacophony, was dispatched. The guards, mistaking the noisy ensemble for a group of rowdy revelers or possibly even thieves, quickly apprehended Lorenzo and his bewildered musicians. They were held until dawn, questioned about their intentions, and only released after a lengthy explanation and a substantial payment from Lorenzo's exasperated father. Lady Beatrice remained entirely undisturbed by the entire affair, having merely ordered her windows to be tightly shut at the first strains of the music. Lorenzo's serenade had led to a night in a jail cell, not a lover's embrace. Number 8. The accidental encounter and convenient rescue. This approach relied on staging a situation where a hopeful suitor could appear heroic or indispensable to the object of their affection. The idea was to orchestrate an accidental meeting where the target of their admiration would find themselves in a minor predicament, allowing the suitor to step in as a rescuer or helpful problem solver. This would highlight their bravery, strength, or cleverness, surely making a lasting impression and prompting gratitude, which might then blossom into affection. It was a script written for a romance, waiting for the unwitting co-star. A rather embarrassing entry in the daily ledger of the local constable in Bristol from the year 1445 documents the misadventure of a young shoemaker's apprentice named Thomas. Thomas harbored a deep crush on Elara, the baker's daughter, who regularly visited the market square to sell bread. Thomas decided to engineer a situation where he could appear as her gallant protector. He noticed that Elara always walked past a certain rickety cart, often piled high with vegetables, on her way to the market. His plan was to discreetly loosen a wheel on the cart, ensuring it would appear to be on the verge of collapsing just as Elara passed. He would then heroically rush forward and stabilize the cart, saving Elara from a potential vegetable avalanche. Thomas executed the first part of his plan with clumsy precision. He loosened the wheel, however. His timing was spectacularly off. Instead of wobbling just as Elara approached, the cart's wheel gave way prematurely, not as Elara passed, but as the burly, ill-tempered market gardener, Ralph, was attempting to move it. Cart tipped over, sending a cascade of cabbages, carrots, and potatoes tumbling across the bustling market square. Ralph, incensed by the sudden destruction of his produce, immediately suspected foul play. His eyes landed on Thomas, who was loitering nearby, looking far too innocent. A brief, one-sided chase ensued, ending with Thomas being publicly chastised and made to help clean up the entire vegetable spill. Elara, meanwhile, simply walked a wider path around the chaos, barely noticing Thomas's predicament, let alone his ill-fated attempt at heroism. His rescue ended with him scrubbing mud off cabbages, not receiving a grateful glance. Another anecdote, recorded by a traveling scholar who documented strange occurrences in the Duchy of Brittany in 1378, tells of a knight, Sir Gaston, who wanted to impress a visiting countess, Lady Eleonora. Lady Eleonora was known for her love of falconry and often rode her horse to a particular clearing to fly her bird. Sir Gaston decided to set up a small, easily surmountable obstacle in her path, a fallen log, not too large, but enough to require a skilled horseman to navigate. He would then happen upon her, offer his assistance, and perhaps even demonstrate his own riding prowess by expertly moving the log. Sir Gaston spent an afternoon carefully dragging a conveniently sized log into the clearing. He then waited, concealed behind some bushes. When Lady Eleanora arrived, her falcon perched on her gloved hand, she spotted the log. Instead of struggling or requiring help, Lady Eleanora, who was an exceptionally skilled rider, simply urged her horse forward. The horse, with a powerful leap, cleared the log effortlessly, barely breaking stride. Sir Gaston, still hidden, watched dumbfounded as Lady Eleanora continued on her way completely unhindered and unaware of his grand plan. He eventually emerged from the bushes, feeling foolish, and had to spend a considerable amount of time dragging the log back to its original location. His accidental obstacle had been nothing more than a minor hurdle for a truly competent rider, and his chance to play the hero had vanished with Lady Eleanora's graceful leap. Number 7. The elaborate gift with secret meaning. Giving gifts was a common way to show affection and respect, but some people tried to elevate this practice by imbuing ordinary objects with secret coded meanings. The idea was to select an item that to an outsider appeared unremarkable, but to the intended recipient held a hidden message only they would understand. This could be a particular flower, symbolizing a specific emotion, a piece of embroidery with a cryptic pattern, or even an animal. The hope was that the recipient would decode the message, appreciate the thoughtfulness, and realize the depth of the sender's feelings, sparking a secret romance. A letter from a merchant in London to his brother in Bruges, dated 1461, discusses a rather awkward situation involving his nephew Edmund. Edmund, a young man of modest means but grand romantic ambitions, had set his sights on the daughter of a wealthy goldsmith, Lady Eleanor. Knowing he could not compete with the expensive gifts lavished upon her by other suitors, Edmund decided to send a symbolic gift. He chose a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a nightingale, believing it would convey his desire to sing praises of her beauty in secret, like the hidden song of the nightingale. He also attached a ribbon of a specific shade of blue, a color he believed represented faithfulness in some obscure manuscript he had once read, carefully wrapped the bird, and had it delivered to Eleanor's home by a street urchin. Eleanor, upon receiving the package, opened it with mild curiosity. She unwrapped the wooden bird and immediately noticed the blue ribbon. Her reaction, however, was not one of romantic insight. Eleanor, being a practical and rather superstitious young woman, instantly recalled an old wives' tale that blue ribbons tied to wooden birds were a charm against toothaches. She promptly hung the nightingale in her bedchamber, grateful for the supposed magical protection it offered her teeth. The secret message of undying love and faithfulness was entirely missed. Edmund, receiving no special acknowledgement or romantic overtures from Eleanor, eventually learned from a gossiping servant that his thoughtful gift was being used as a dental prophylactic. His symbol of love was merely a toothache charm. Another instance, from the household accounts of a minor lord in Kent, circa 1390, mentions a strange delivery made to his daughter, Lady Catherine. A young squire, Richard, who was quite smitten with Catherine, decided to send her a pair of white gloves. This might seem normal, but Richard had carefully prepared the gloves himself, stitching a tiny, barely visible emblem of a single thorny rose on the inner cuff of one of the gloves. In the obscure language of flowers that Richard had studied, a single thorny rose symbolized love at first sight, but with challenges. He believed Catherine, known for her sharp mind, would surely notice the subtle stitching and understand his deeply meaningful message. Catherine received the gloves and examined them. She admired the quality of the leather and the fine stitching. She did indeed notice the tiny, thorny rose. However, Catherine was a practical woman, and her immediate thought was that the rose, being thorny, might snag her delicate sleeves. She promptly took a small pair of shears and carefully snipped off the tiny embroidered rose, believing it to be a slightly imperfect detail in an otherwise lovely pair of gloves. She then proceeded to wear the gloves to the next feast, completely oblivious to the elaborate romantic declaration she had just physically removed. Richard, seeing her wearing the gloves without the symbolic rose, felt a pang of despair, unsure if she had deliberately rejected his message or simply hadn't noticed it. He later learned, through a maid, that Catherine had found the rose a little rough and had simply cut it off. His elaborate symbolism was met with the pragmatism of garment care. Number 6. The accidental panode of talent or virtue. This hack involved deliberately placing oneself in a situation where one's best qualities, be it skill in jousting, mastery of a musical instrument, quick wit, or even exceptional piety, could be observed by the desired person without appearing to be overtly showing off. The goal was to subtly demonstrate one's desirable traits, hoping the recipient would notice and be impressed. It was a carefully staged performance, designed to look entirely natural and unplanned, leading to admiration and attraction. A rather unfortunate entry in the diary of a young nobleman's tutor in Aragon, dated 1472, describes the efforts of young Lord Rodrigo. Rodrigo was captivated by the beauty and intelligence of Lady Isabella, a visiting scholar's daughter. He knew Isabella valued intellect and wit above mere physical prowess. Rodrigo decided to stage an accidental display of his literary knowledge. He spent days memorizing complex passages from ancient texts and witty Latin phrases. During a stroll through the castle gardens, he noticed Isabella reading near a fountain. Rodrigo then deliberately walked towards the fountain, carrying a weighty scholarly tome. As he approached, he accidentally tripped, sending the book sprawling open at Isabella's feet. His plan was to then lament the interruption to his deep study and engage Isabella in a profound discussion of the text. However, as Rodrigo dramatically stumbled, his foot caught on a loose paving stone, and he did not just trip, but fell rather awkwardly into the fountain itself. He emerged, drenched, sputtering, and his impressive scholarly tome was utterly ruined by the water, its parchment pages dissolving into a soggy mess. Isabella, startled, looked up from her book, not with admiration, but with concern for his welfare. She offered him a dry cloth and quickly moved on, clearly more amused by his soaped state than impressed by his scholarly aspirations. His grand display of intellect had resulted in a public dunking and a ruined book, and Isabella left with her book undisturbed, a small smirk on her face. A similar attempt is outlined in a minor legal complaint filed in Paris in 1385. A skilled stonemason, Jean-Luc, was deeply smitten with the daughter of a wealthy merchant, Marie Say. Marie was known for her appreciation of fine craftsmanship and artistry. Jean-Luc devised a plan to showcase his exceptional masonry skills in a way she would notice. He began working on an elaborate carving on the exterior of a newly built guild hall, a prominent building Marie passed every day. His idea was to choose a highly visible section, and as she walked by, he would be working on a particularly intricate detail, perhaps a gargoyle or a decorative arch, demonstrating his precision and artistic flair. Timed his work perfectly, ensuring he was chiseling away at a challenging part of the carving every morning as Marie walked by. Jean-Luc spent weeks on this project, crafting a stunning lion's head with incredible detail. However, Marie was far less observant than Jean-Luc hoped. Each morning, as she passed the guild hall, her attention was firmly fixed on the bustling market across the street, where new fabrics and imported goods were displayed. She noticed the new guild hall certainly, but she never once paused to examine the intricate carvings or to appreciate the skill of the artisan. Her mind was on commerce, not on architectural details. Jean-Luc's beautiful lion's head, while admired by other masons and passers-by, went completely unappreciated by the one person he desperately wanted to impress. He completed the carving, a testament to his talent, but it yielded no romantic fruit with Marie, who continued to walk by, utterly oblivious to the subtle display of his artistic devotion. Number 5. The overly dramatic public declaration. Sometimes, rather than subtlety, hopeful romantics opted for the grand overt gesture, believing that a bold public declaration of love would sweep their beloved off their feet. This could involve interrupting a public gathering, writing a love poem on a public wall, or even challenging a rival to a duel for the lady's hand. The idea was to leave no doubt as to the depth of one's feelings, making it impossible for the object of affection to ignore them. It was a gamble for high stakes, risking public embarrassment for the chance of public adoration. Collection of village gossip, penned by a bored scribe in a small priory in Oxfordshire around 1490, includes a particularly vivid account of a young farmer named Colin. Colin was desperately in love with Bridget, the innkeeper's daughter, who was known for her sharp tongue and even sharper wit. One market day, when the village square was packed with people, Colin, fueled by a mixture of ale and boundless optimism, decided it was time for his grand gesture. He climbed onto the village pump, attracting the attention of the crowd. With a deep breath, he began to bellow a poem he had written for Bridget, a long, rambling ode to her beauty and his undying devotion. He spoke of her eyes being like stars in the deepest night, and her laughter like the trilling of larks. The crowd, initially amused, quickly grew restless as the poem seemed to have no end. Bridget, however, was not amused. She emerged from the inn, hands on her hips, her face a mask of annoyance. When Colin finally finished his lengthy declaration, a hush fell over the square. Bridget, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, simply shouted, "Colin, get down from that pump. You're making the chickens nervous and your rhyming is worse than a pig's grunting." Crowd erupted in laughter, and Colin, red-faced, scrambled off the pump, his grand declaration having achieved nothing but public ridicule and Bridget's clear disdain. His attempt to woo her with poetry had only earned him a sharp verbal rebuke. A more serious example comes from a court record in Bologna, Italy, from 1340, detailing a dispute between two rival students, Marco and Piero, both vying for the affections of a tailor's daughter, Sophia. Marco, believing that a display of masculine assertiveness would win Sophia's heart, decided to challenge Piero to a public debate on a theological point, with Sophia as the implied prize. He announced his challenge in the university courtyard, hoping to embarrass Piero and elevate himself in Sophia's eyes. The debate commenced, and it was indeed public, attracting a large crowd of students and curious townsfolk. Marco, however, was so focused on grandiloquent rhetoric and insulting Piero that he completely overlooked the logical flaws in his own arguments. Piero, though less theatrical, was more learned and systematic in his reasoning. The debate devolved into a shouting match, with Marco growing increasingly flustered and making several glaring errors in his theological arguments. Sophia, who had initially been present, grew bored and discreetly slipped away, returning to her father's shop to sew. The debate continued for an hour, culminating in Marco stomping off in a huff, having lost the argument and his temper. The crowd dispersed, some laughing, some shaking their heads. Sophia, when later asked about the debate, merely shrugged, saying she had more important things to do than listen to two loud boys argue about angels. Marco's dramatic challenge had only soaked his poor temper and faulty scholarship, leaving Sophia entirely unimpressed and still sewing. Number 4. The strategic display of wealth or status. In a society heavily defined by class and property, some individuals believed that simply patooting their wealth or high status would be enough to attract a desirable partner. This could involve wearing overly extravagant clothing, displaying expensive jewelry, riding the finest horses, or hosting lavish feasts. The idea was to demonstrate one's eligibility and desirability by implying security, comfort, and influence. It was a direct appeal to practicality and ambition, hoping to draw a partner who valued material advantages. Tax ledger from Strasbourg dated 1455 indirectly references the downfall of a rich merchant named Herr Richter. Richter recently arrived in the city and eager to marry into an established noble family specifically aimed to impress Lady Anneliese, a baron's daughter known for her frugality and charitable works. Richter, misunderstanding Anneliese's values, decided to overwhelm her with a display of his immense wealth. He commissioned most expensive silks and furs for his clothing, purchased a fleet of highly decorated horses, and hosted a series of extravagant banquets, serving exotic spices and rare wines that cost a fortune. He made sure Lady Anneliese was always seated at his side, allowing her to witness his opulence firsthand. His intention was to show her the life of luxury she could have as his wife. However, Lady Anneliese found his ostentatious displays vulgar and wasteful. She was actively involved in managing her family's estates efficiently and distributing charity to the poor. She found Richter's lavish spending to be irresponsible and morally questionable, especially when so many in the city struggled. She quietly declined his repeated invitations, eventually sending a polite but firm letter, stating her preference for a partner of more modest and thoughtful habits. Richter, puzzled and frustrated, continued his lavish life but never secured a noble bride, his wealth having alienated the very person he sought to impress. His attempt to buy affection had only highlighted his lack of understanding of true value. Another tale, from a collection of fables compiled by a German monk in 1370, recounts the folly of a young knight, Sir Lothar, who was excessively proud of his lineage and his family's ancient castle. He sought to marry a beautiful commoner, Agnes, the daughter of a successful weaver, believing his noble status alone would sway her. Sir Lothar repeatedly found ways to emphasize his noble birth, his family's long history, and the vastness of his ancestral lands. He would subtly, or not so subtly, mention his lineage in conversation, or direct Agnes's attention to his coat of arms whenever they met. He even offered to give her a tour of his sprawling, somewhat decaying castle, convinced that its ancient stones would speak volumes of his worth. Agnes, however, was a pragmatic young woman with a strong sense of self-worth. She valued hard work, honesty, and a good sense of humor. She found Sir Lothar's constant boasting tedious, and his preoccupation with his lineage tiresome. When he finally brought her to his castle, expecting her to be awestruck, Agnes politely admired the architecture, but privately found the drafty halls and endless corridors rather impractical. She preferred the cozy warmth of her father's well-maintained home. Agnes eventually married a fellow weaver's son, a kind and diligent young man who made her laugh and who showed her respect, not just his family's crest. Sir Lothar's ancient lineage and grand castle had meant little to Agnes, who valued character over inherited status. Number 3. The feigned intellectual or spiritual depth. For those who believed their chosen love interest valued intellect or piety, the strategy was to present oneself as a profound thinker, a devout soul, or a person of immense wisdom. This might involve quoting philosophical texts, engaging in lengthy theological discussions, or demonstrating an exaggerated devotion to religious practices. The goal was to appear intellectually or spiritually superior, hoping to attract a partner who appreciated such qualities and would see beyond any superficial flaws. A series of letters between scholarly acquaintances in Siena, Italy in 1360, recounts the misadventures of a student named Giovanni Andrani. Giovanni was smitten with Isabella, a woman renowned for her sharp mind and her profound interest in classical literature. Giovanni, while of average intellect, decided to present himself as a brilliant scholar. He spent sleepless nights, cramming passages from Virgil and Cicero, memorizing obscure historical facts, and practicing witty, profound pronouncements. During a public lecture on ancient Roman history, where Isabella was known to attend, Giovanni strategically positioned himself near her. At an opportune moment, he raised his hand and launched into a long, convoluted question that incorporated several obscure Latin phrases and references to texts he had only just read. He believed he was demonstrating his vast knowledge. Isabella, however, was a true scholar, and quickly recognized that Giovanni's question, while filled with impressive-sounding words, was actually incoherent and revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the topic. She politely but firmly corrected him, pointing out the logical flaws in his statement and explaining the correct interpretation of the Latin phrases he had misused. Giovanni, utterly exposed, stammered and quickly sat down, his face flushed. Isabella, meanwhile, turned her attention back to the lecture, completely uninterested in engaging with someone who feigned knowledge. His attempt to appear brilliant had only highlighted his superficiality and led to a very public intellectual humiliation. A local legend from a small parish in Cornwall, dating back to the early 15th century, tells of a young man named Peregrine who was deeply religious and wished to marry Elspeth, a devout woman who spent much of her time tending to the church's needs. Peregrine, wanting to impress her with his piety, began to exaggerate his religious observances. He attended every single church service, no matter how minor, and always made sure to be the first to arrive and the last to leave. He ostentatiously made the sign of the cross and bowed deeply at every appropriate moment, sometimes even adding extra gestures of devotion. He would also loudly offer to help with chores around the church, often doing so with exaggerated sighs of spiritual dedication. Elspeth, however, was a woman of quiet, sincere faith. She found Peregrine's public displays of piety to be performative and insincere. She noticed his elaborate bows seemed more like theatrical gestures than genuine reverence, and his sighs of dedication sounded more like complaints about the work. One Sunday, after a particularly long service during which Peregrine had knelt for an excessive period, groaning softly, Elspeth approached him. She did not offer praise for his devotion. Instead, she quietly suggested he might find more genuine spiritual comfort in simple, heartfelt prayer rather than such strenuous public displays. Peregrine, chastened, realized his feigned piety had been transparent. Elspeth continued her quiet service to the church, and Peregrine remained a worshipper she politely tolerated, but nothing more. His attempts to appear devout had merely made him seem insincere. Number 2. The accidental display of mundane competence. Beyond grand gestures or displays of wealth, some people tried to win affection by subtly plating their competence in everyday tasks. The idea was to engineer a situation where they could accidentally demonstrate their practical skills, their ability to manage a household, or their proficiency in a common trade. This would appeal to those seeking a reliable, capable partner, implying that they would be a good provider, a diligent spouse, or a helpful neighbor. It was a quieter, more understated hack, designed to show stability and usefulness. A short entry in a set of family letters from the German city of Cologne around 1480 describes a young woman named Greta. Greta, a baker's daughter, was interested in a young merchant's apprentice, Franz, who was known for his love of order and efficiency. Greta decided to subtly showcase her domestic competence. She knew Franz often passed by her family's bakery during his morning rounds. So Greta would meticulously arrange the fresh loaves and pastries in the front window, ensuring every single item was perfectly aligned, every crumb swept away and the counter gleaming. She would also strategically be seen mending clothes or diligently spinning wool on the doorstep, always looking busy and perfectly organized. Her goal was to demonstrate her impeccable household management skills. Franz did indeed notice the neatness of the bakery. He found it appealing, however, his interest was purely professional. He simply concluded that the baker had an excellent, diligent assistant who kept the shop in perfect order, making it an efficient place to buy bread. He often nodded politely to Greta, but his conversations were always about the bread itself or the weather, never about her personal qualities. He saw her as a very competent shopkeeper, not a potential partner. Greta's meticulous efforts at displaying domestic perfection only solidified her image as a highly efficient and rather unromantic part of the bakery operation. Her accidental display of order had merely ensured consistently good bread sales. A similar effort is chronicled in the parish records of a village in Somerset, England, from 1395. A young farmer, Arthur, wanted to impress Eleanor, the daughter of the local blacksmith, who was admired for her practical nature and her appreciation for a well-kept farm. Arthur decided to accidentally display his exceptional farming skills. He would deliberately choose to mend fences, clear ditches, or expertly plow his fields at the exact times he knew Eleanor would be passing on her way to the village well. He would labor with exaggerated diligence, ensuring his movements were fluid and efficient, his tools perfectly maintained, and his fields remarkably neat. He was certain Eleanor would see his hard work and recognize his potential as a good husband. Eleanor did indeed notice Arthur. She saw him working in his fields, and she certainly appreciated the sight of a well-maintained farm. However, Eleanor was also a very practical and observant young woman who had grown up watching her father, the blacksmith, work tirelessly and efficiently. She saw Arthur's efforts and simply concluded that he was a very hard-working and capable farmer, just like many other capable farmers in the village. Her respect for him was purely professional. A recognition of good husbandry, she never saw it as a romantic gesture. Eleanor later married a cooper from a neighboring village, a man whose skills were in carpentry, not farming, but who possessed a cheerful disposition and a habit of bringing her wildflowers. Arthur's display of agricultural excellence had merely earned him the quiet respect of a fellow villager, not a place in her heart. Number 1. The subtle art of parental manipulation. The good example. In an era where marriages were often arranged or heavily influenced by families, some ambitious individuals tried a very subtle, long-term hack to sway parental opinion. Instead of directly wooing the person they desired, they would focus on impressing the parents or other influential family members. This involved demonstrating qualities that parents would value in a prospective son-in-law or daughter-in-law: industriousness, piety, financial stability, good manners, or social connections. The hope was that by making themselves appear to be the perfect choice in the eyes of the family, the parents would then push for the match, making the dating process much smoother or even unnecessary. Cautionary tale from a collection of noble family histories in France, dated 1420, tells of a young nobleman, Gaston, who wished to marry Lady Marie, the daughter of a powerful duke. Gaston knew that direct courtship would be difficult and likely subject to the duke's strict approval. So, Gaston focused his efforts on impressing the duke himself. He began to make frequent polite visits to the duke's court, always offering wise counsel on matters of state, courting his military knowledge, and subtly emphasizing his family's ancient lineage and extensive lands. He joined the duke on hunting trips, proving himself a skilled hunter. He always presented himself as impeccably mannered, devout, and politically shrewd. Gaston believed that by making himself indispensable and highly desirable to the duke as a son-in-law, the duke would naturally arrange a match with Marie. The duke was indeed very impressed with Gaston. He valued Gaston's counsel, his loyalty, and his potential as an ally. The duke spoke highly of Gaston to all his friends and associates. However, the duke had another daughter, Lady Isabel, who was older than Marie and had recently been widowed. Seeing Gaston's many admirable qualities and wanting to secure a strong alliance for his family, the duke arranged for Gaston to marry Isabel, believing she would be a more suitable and available match. Gaston, utterly dismayed, found himself betrothed to the older sister, not the younger one he had secretly desired. His meticulous efforts to impress the duke had been so successful that he had been matched with the best available option, which unfortunately was not his intended bride. His parental manipulation had worked too well, but for the wrong daughter. Another similar miscalculation is found in the local records of a guild in London from the year 1465. A young apprentice tailor, Henry, was deeply smitten with the master tailor's daughter, Alice. Knowing that the master tailor was a stern man who valued hard work and dedication above all else, Henry decided to become the most exemplary apprentice the master had ever seen. He worked tirelessly, often staying late to finish tasks, never complaining, and always ensuring his work was of the highest quality. He always volunteered for the most difficult jobs and was always the first to arrive at the workshop in the morning. He kept his tools meticulously clean and organized, and he often offered to help the master with his personal errands, always with a polite and respectful demeanor. His plan was that the master, recognizing his unparalleled dedication, would see him as the perfect, hard-working son-in-law for Alice. The master tailor did indeed notice Henry's exceptional work ethic. He praised Henry to other guild members, commending his diligence and skill. So impressed was the master with Henry's capabilities that, when a highly prestigious and lucrative commission came in from a wealthy nobleman, the master decided that Henry was the perfect person to oversee the complex project. The commission required Henry to travel to a distant town for several months, setting up a temporary workshop and managing a team of journeymen. It was a massive promotion, a sign of the master's immense trust and confidence in Henry. Alice, meanwhile, was delighted for Henry, seeing him as a valued colleague, but she never saw him as anything more than the best apprentice her father had. While Henry was away, diligently working on the nobleman's commission, Alice fell in love with a charming young cooper who delivered barrels to the tailor's shop daily. Upon his return, Henry found Alice engaged to the cooper. His painstaking efforts to prove his worth as an apprentice had only earned him a demanding, distant assignment, allowing his desired bride to find love elsewhere. His plan to impress the father had led to a professional triumph, but a romantic defeat.